How's going guys, welcome to the channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto got banished and got mass harem within 7 deadly sins. Part 2. If you wants to see awesome fanfiction like this, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's get into the video. It has been a week since the group found Diane and fought against Gilthander. Currently, the group was on their way to Dalmari town, which was a couple miles outside of base dungeon, where the Fox's Sin of Greed was held. Right now, we see the women of the group taking a break outside with Diane talking to the Kunoichi about other abilities and things they can do with Meliodas inside the boar hat room resting by force due to a paralysis seal that was placed on him to keep him in bed. So you guys use this chakra to perform abilities and techniques such as breathing fireballs, walking on water, and creating those chains of yours. Diane asked with stars in her eyes, excited at hearing more about what the Kunoichi can do. Kushina nodded and said, yeah, but the chains are more mine and my daughter's abilities. Diane was confused, why is that? How come only you two can do that? Naruto was the one who took over from here, you see, in the elemental nations, there are some people who have special abilities that only their clan can use. We call abilities like this Kekkei Genkai or bloodline limit, and basically it makes it where only specific people and their families have a unique ability or skill. Our chains are a part of our clan's Kekkei Genkai, and so only me, my mom, and others from our clan can use them. Another example would be that some people from the elemental nations gain a mixed elemental chakra that allows them to use different elements other than water, wind, earth, fire, and lightning. One such element is the Bakuten, or the explosion release, which is a mix of earth and lightning chakra, allows the user to create explosions through different means, such as an explosive material that they create from their bodies that causes powerful explosions, or they can add an explosion to their attacks when using taijutsu or hand-to-hand combat for more damage. At hearing this, Diane got stars in her eyes again while imagining herself with explosions coming from her hands. Diane shook her head and then turned back and asked, what else can you guys do? Hana decided to then take over from here. Well, some other things we can do is form contract summoning animals, like frogs, dogs, and hawks being some. That doesn't sound too impressive, to be honest. Diane said while looking not very excited about that. Hana and the rest just laughed at her reaction. Well, began Hana, I can understand when you just hear that we can summon animals, but you see, the animals are different sizes and can be the size of our hands to being as big as you. At this, Diane's eyes went wide before she then heard, sometimes also, depending on which species it is, they can also be bigger than you. Diane then began imagining a dog the same size as her and then got the stars again. Now that sounds cool. Diane exclaimed. The Kunoichi laughed at how excited Diane was about hearing what they can do. Anko then began, along with it we can also use gain jutsus or illusions, we can also enhance our strength and speed by channeling chakra to our limbs, and with seals, we can do almost anything. As Anko was describing each ability, Diane was thinking about each one. When she heard about how they can cast illusions, she wasn't really sure how to feel about that one. When she heard about being able to enhance their strength, Diane thought that was pretty cool, since that would mean they could be stronger, depending on how much they channel. However, the last part is what really interested her. Wait, you can do anything with these seals of yours? Diane asked, with a question in mind. Anko seemed to think about that, well, almost anything. There are some things that we can't do with seals, like living forever and such, but yeah, most things should be possible. Diane then looked nervous before she asked, could seals help make me smaller? The Kunoichi were surprised at this request before they all looked at Kushina, who was deep in thought, mumbling some stuff that was missed, before she looked at Diane, who had a look of nervousness and slight hope, and asked, before I answer that, I need to know. Diane nodded her head, ready to answer the questions, why do you want to be smaller? Diane then sighed while having a look of sadness, it's because in the past, I always wanted to be able to experience some of the things that humans experience without scaring everyone off. I want to be able to walk among you guys without the fear of stepping on one of you. Diane began to get tears in her eyes, also to be able to show him how much I like him. This last part she muttered, hoping no one would hear. However, unknown to Diane, Kushina and Hana heard what she said, and both smiled at such a poor reason. Well, in that case, how could I possibly say no? Kushina said with a smile, getting Diane to brighten up with tears still in her eyes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Diane began saying over and over, incredibly happy at being able to be smaller. The Kunoichi all smiled at how happy Diane looked at hearing that she could be smaller. Now, I will begin working on it right away so that you can have it as soon as possible. Also, do you want it where you can change your size at will? Kushina asked, with her answer being Diane nodding her head up and down rapidly like a little kid. Yes. That would be so useful. Diane exclaimed. Alright, well, I better get to work and we had better keep on moving if we want to make it to Dalmari town by morning. Kushina said. Right. Said the others who were present. And with that they were back on their way to Dalmari town. Couple hours later. It was another couple hours before the group finally reached Dalmari town. Once they got there, the first thing they did was look for a doctor to check and make sure Meliodas' wound was fine. We now find Kurenai, Anko, Hana, Naruto, Kushina, Elizabeth and Hawk standing around in a doctor's office, with Diane outside by the window as the doctor checked Meliodas' shoulder. Well, I can tell you for sure that you did an excellent job of wrapping and disinfecting the wound, informed the doctor. Hana felt pride in herself at this bit. Now, it looks to be healing well. I would say another day or two of rest and some medicine, and it will be all healed. Wait here while I go get the medicine, informed the doctor before he got up and left. The group sighed in relief that nothing has gone wrong just yet. However, while everyone was waiting for the doctor to come back, none of them noticed an insect that seemed to stare at Diane from a rooftop. In a dark room. I found them. They're at the doctor's building, said a feminine voice. Are you going, Freesia? Asked another voice to the now named Freesia. Freesia was a woman who wore dark red armor with fur around the bottom half of her legs. Her helmet looked like an eight-legged spider, and in her hands was a green dual-tailed whip. The now named Freesia got up from where she was sitting. Yeah, I'll be going to deliver the first strike and end him along with that little group of his. She exclaimed while beginning to swing and twirl her whip. However, in her head, she was thinking, I hate this. I hate how the Holy Knights have changed from how they were before. Why did I join these jackasses anyways? Kurenai cleared her throat, gaining everyone's attention. Alright, well, now that we know he will be alright, we should make a plan. The group nodded and began to listen. Now, Diane, you will head to base dungeon to begin checking it out. Right. You can count on me. Diane exclaimed. Kurenai nodded then said, well, you do that, we'll go get the others, then follow soon after. Is this good with everyone? Everyone nodded yes, and with that Kurenai, Hana, Naruto and Kushina went to the boar hat to get the others. This left Anko, Diane, Elizabeth and Hawk alone while the doctor got the medicine. Well, began Diane while getting up, I better start heading to base dungeon. And with that, Diane began to make her way in the direction of base dungeon, but before she could get too far, Elizabeth came running out, with Hawk and Anko following her. Wait! Exclaimed Elizabeth, gaining Diane's attention. What's up? Asked Diane, curious on why Elizabeth stopped her. I wanted to know why you seem so excited about meeting Sir Ban. Asked Elizabeth. Diane began to blush before stuttering, what? No. Why would you think that? Because, as we came closer to base dungeon, you grew happier and more excited every day. Elizabeth explained, getting Diane to blush even more before she continued, I figured you were simply happy about being in a town and Meliodas getting checked, but you always seemed happiest whenever we would talk about Sir Ban. So, I wanted to know why you were excited about seeing Sir Ban again. Elizabeth concluded, with Diane beginning to look like a real giant tomato. Diane then sighed and put her head down, while still blushing before she looked back at Elizabeth and began, well, you see, I guess it started way back when I first met Ban. Flashback, many years ago. Diane was currently standing with her hands on her hips, looking quite annoyed. Why, you may ask. Well, it may have something to do with the 4 knights that are currently in front of her. Get out of here! Yelled one of the knights. No one wants your kind here. Yelled another knight. Diane then crossed her arms, humph. Why should I listen to you? It's not like you can do anything to force me. Diane said, while still looking annoyed, besides, isn't it rude to try and force a beautiful girl to do something she doesn't want? What beautiful girl? You're just a giant. You're not beautiful. The knights yelled. Go back to your homeland. They yelled at her. Nobody could ever love monsters like you. They yelled again. I can't believe how arrogant you humans are. And all because there are so many of you. Diane said with a condescending look. Why you? We'll show you and force you to leave. Get her. Yelled one of the knights. Right. Yelled the others, and with that they began to charge at her. However, before they could make it halfway to her, the knights and Diane all heard a loud whoa. Before they then heard a crash, followed by a loud oomph sound. This made them all stop and turn to the sound, where they all saw a man who seemed to have fallen from a tree and was currently on the ground, rubbing his head before he stood up and yawned, showing his slightly enlarged canines. He had short silverish blue hair with red eyes that seemed to have a tinge of violet to them. He was wearing dark brown shoes, black, baggy pants with a black open vest with royal blue lining that showed his muscular physique. On top of it all, he was wearing a long black trench coat that seemed to fall down to his shins, and lying next to him on the floor was a dark purple drawstring bag with a light red bottom that was currently open, showing that inside were some clothes, wanted posters, some bottles of alcohol, a couple of spearhead-shaped throwing knives, and a steel 3-section staff. Diane and the knights watched as he then reached down, grabbed his bag, and put it over his shoulder, before he then looked at the five of them with a curious look, before he asked, "What's going on here? Move along. This has nothing to do with you," yelled the knights. "Just move along, human. I don't need your help," yelled Diane, thinking that this human is going to treat her badly as well. But she was surprised when, now why should leave a beautiful girl to fend for herself? He asked with a raised eyebrow. This surprised Diane as she had not expected him to compliment her like that and began to blush lightly. She was even more surprised when he began moving to stand between her and the knights. He stood there, with his bag over his right shoulder, his left hand in his pants pocket, slouched and a lazy look in his eyes. "Hey assholes," he addressed the knights, which made the knights furious at how disrespectful he was being, and Diane giggled a bit, which the man caught and smiled lightly. "Why don't you guys just leave her alone? After all, it's not like she did anything to you. Why you? How dare you take the side of a monster? You bring shame to humans," yelled one of the knights. The man simply raised an eyebrow while pointing a finger at himself with his left hand. "I bring shame to humans. I think you must have me confused for yourself because only the worst kind of scum gang up on a beautiful girl," he said, making the other five present red in the face for different reasons. The knights were red because they were furious at how disrespectful this man was being. Diane, however, was red because he called her beautiful again. "You traitor," yelled the knights, "we'll show you what happens when you side with monsters. Guys, let's get him," yelled a knight. "Yeah." And with that, the four knights began to charge again, this time aiming for the disrespectful man standing in their way. The knights and Diane all saw that he hadn't moved or changed his stance at all and expected the man was going to be killed easy. What they didn't expect was that right when their swords were about to hit him, he disappeared from their sight. "You do know, you're not gonna be able to do much with those sticks in your hands, right?" asked a voice from the side. The knights and Diane turned and saw him leaning on the tree he had previously fallen out of, with all four knight swords. Three were leaning against the tree with him, while he examined the fourth in his hands. The knights and Diane were all surprised to see this. The knights were confused on why those swords looked familiar before looking at their hands and saw that they were holding a bunch of sticks. That was when they realized he had stolen and replaced their swords with sticks in the blink of an eye. Diane was impressed that a human could move so fast. Now, he began, gaining everyone's attention on him again. "Do you still want to try and fight, or are you going to leave now?" the man asked, while now glaring at the knights with a dark aura around him, causing the knights to get scared and begin running away. Diane watched the knights run away before turning to the man, as he relaxed while giving a sigh of relief, before he sat down and continued examining the swords before asking himself, "I wonder how much these would sell for." "Hey." Diane began, gaining the man's attention, "I didn't need some puny human standing up for me. I could have taken care of myself," Diane exclaimed, feeling like the human thought she was a pushover. The man simply looked at her before going back to examining the swords and replying, "I know that, but that's not why I decided to stand up for you." Diane grew confused. "Then why did you decide to stand up for me?" she asked while crossing her arms underneath her bust, making them look bigger than they already are. "Because it was the right thing to do," replied the man while still looking at the swords, getting a surprised look from Diane, before he then added, "Besides, I just didn't like how those guys were ganging up on a beautiful girl such as yourself." Diane began blushing again, before shaking her head and glaring at him, which didn't look very menacing, considering she still had a blush. "Why are you lying?" she asked, getting the man to stop examining the swords before giving her a confused look. "What do you mean?" asked the man while tilting his head. "Come on, I know you can't possibly think I'm beautiful. You probably just said that to get on the knight's nerves, when in reality, you really think I'm a monster," explained Diane, thinking she had him. However, she was surprised when the man began chuckling before flat out laughing. "Why are you laughing?" Diane roared, wondering why he was laughing. The man continued to chuckle for a bit before he looked at her with a wide, happy smirk. "I'm laughing because you actually believe I would think you're a monster." This surprised Diane before the man said, "Why would I think a beautiful girl, such as yourself, is a monster?" Diane began blushing up a storm before she put her head down and began saying in a low voice, "Because I'm different from you." "And what's wrong with that?" Diane raised her head in surprise, getting her to look at the man, who was currently wearing a soft smile, while still having a lazy look in his eyes. "There's nothing wrong with being different. I have some friends who are different from those around them. All that matters is that you find people who accept you for who you are." Diane was surprised by this man, who instead of thinking and calling her a monster, instead called her beautiful and meant it. She began to blush again before she then cleared her throat and asked, "Well, can we maybe be friends?" The man nodded and said, "Sure, we can be friends." Before he then began chuckling again, this got Diane to blush a little more before she asked, "What? What are you laughing about?" The man stopped chuckling and looked at her before saying, I'm laughing at how we became friends and yet we still don't know each other's names. The man began saying before he began laughing again at the end. Diane looked surprised before she joined in the laughing, I guess you're right. So, let's introduce ourselves. Diane then kneeled down and held out her hand before saying, my name is Diane and I'm from the giant clan. The man looked at her hand for a second before he got up and moved towards her and gripped her hand as best he could, with her doing the same, being careful not to crush his hand. Nice to meet you, Diane. My name is Ban Fox, of the human race. Flashback end. Diane had a beautiful, soft smile on her face before she continued, from then on, we had been almost inseparable. We just moved where the wind took us, enjoying life, hanging out with villages that welcomed me in. And the villages that didn't, we would camp outside of the village and then leave in the morning. Diane then began laughing, but every time we began to leave those villages, he would have me wait for a second before he ran back to the village for about 20 minutes every time before he came running back with this huge proud smile on his face, with the entire village chasing him. Diane started to laugh even harder when she remembered the villagers, all of them were either covered in paint, feathers, or had bad makeup and weird hairdos. Like orange afros, green spikes, or, my favorite, pink mohawks. This got Elizabeth and Hawk to start laughing, but Anko looked deep in thought. Those pranks sound familiar, like I've seen them before. Thought Anko, but the one I remember doing them at the village when Anko's thoughts began to trail off when she remembered the only person who ever did pranks like that in the village. Anko's eyes then went wide at that thought, no. Is it possible? Anko then began to think carefully on her assumption, but that doesn't make sense. Diane is describing her encounter from many years ago, but he was banished only 4 years ago. So, how would that work? As Anko was thinking, Diane, Elizabeth and Hawk just got done laughing, but she was brought out from her thoughts when Diane continued to talk. We had a lot of fun and we actually joined the 7 deadly sins together. But when we were framed for the Great Holy Knight's death, we all separated and I haven't seen him since. Diane frowned when she said this, before she then got a soft smile, so if I seem excited, the reason is because this will be the first time in 10 years that I have seen my best friend again. Elizabeth, Anko, and Hawk all smiled at Diane, happy that she will be able to see her friend again for the first time in a long time. Well, began Elizabeth, good luck Lady Diane, and stay safe. Diane smiled and nodded before she got up to begin heading to base dungeon. But, before she could begin moving, all 4 of them noticed that the sky near base dungeon was getting dark and was moving towards the town. Are they thunderclouds? Hawk asked, is it Gilthunder again? No, Anko said, it sounds like wings. Elizabeth then said, this can't bugs. Hawk then exclaimed, not just any bugs. It's a massive swarm of poisonous bugs. The 3 women were shocked at this exclamation before they then watched as the swarm got closer. Then, when the bugs were right above the town, they all began spitting poisonous acid on the town, melting everything that was hit. This surprised the group as they watched the town being melted slowly. This must be an attack from a holy knight, exclaimed Hawk. Diane. We're counting on you to help. However, I hate bugs. Diane has a severe dislike for bugs. Elizabeth then noticed that the bugs were attacking the doctor's building too. So she began running to the doctor's building to try and warn Meliodas. Anko noticed she was running back and gave chase while forming some hand signs before she ended on Tiger and mentally shouted, Kaiten. Nkakik no jutsu. But that led Anko lose a giant fireball into the sky, burning a good chunk of the insects. This caught Elizabeth's, Hawk's, and Diane's attention, and they were all amazed by this, with Diane having stars in her eyes again. But then Diane shook her head and got serious, I can't let you show me up like that. Diane said, before she then slammed her hand on the ground, besides, we're stronger than the holy knights. She then raised her hand and from the ground came several pillars of earth that destroyed the rest of the bugs, so, letting a few bugs stop me would make me look bad. The trio were amazed to see how easily Diane destroyed the rest of the bugs. Before they began to check on everyone in the town. However, while the 4 were outside making sure everyone was safe and sound, Dr. Dana had come back with the medicine. Here you go. This will help give you some comfort for the pain and it will make you feel sleepy, so make sure to go right to sleep right after. You still need rest after all, said Dr. Dana. Meliodas took the bowl and said with a smile, thank you very much for helping us. And with that Meliodas drank the medicine before laying down on the bed, going right to sleep. Dr. Dana then began to cry and sobbed, please forgive me. I don't have a choice. Meanwhile, in base dungeon. The 2 guards, who were currently standing outside of Ban's cell, began talking. Hey, wanna bet on who will win? Asked one of the guards. What do you mean? Asked the other. The weird fangs and the 7 deadly sins, they're fighting right now, said the first guard. This got the attention of a certain prisoner with silver blue hair as he continued to listen in on the conversation. "That's not much of fight. I heard that they currently only have their captain and one other member," replied the second guard. This now really got the attention of the prisoner inside the cell, and just as he was about to kick down the door, he heard something even more interesting. "True, but I also heard there is a group of women traveling with them, and one of them actually breathed fire just by making some weird hand gestures," the first guard said. This got the prisoner's eyes to widen before he finally decided to make his presence known. "Well, that sounds really cool," came a voice from inside the cell. This surprised the guards, who were immediately on alert when they heard the voice continue speaking. "Sounds like it ought to be fun. Especially with that group of women who can breathe fire with just a few hand gestures." As soon as the voice was done talking, there was a loud bang. At the same time as a footprint was indented into the steel door. It then began to fall down until it hit the floor with another resounding bang. The guards were terrified as they saw a silhouette of a man begin walking out of the cell. Out of the cell came a man with long, messy, silverish blue hair that reached his upper back with thick facial hair to match and red eyes that had a touch of violet. He had unbuttoned purple pants with metal studs and holes that revealed where the metal spikes had previously been. He still had 2 more spikes in his body, with one in his left shin and the other in his right forearm. But the thing that really drew attention was the red fox symbol on the left side of his abdominals. "Ah." The man groaned while cracking his neck. "It feels so good to walk around every now and then." "No way. The 7 deadly sins, ban. The fox sin," exclaimed the first guard. The second guard then exclaimed, "Damn you. How did you get out of there and why now?" The now named Ban said, "Isn't it obvious?" He then reached down for the spike in his shin and pulled it out with a little effort that was heard in his voice when he said, "I kicked the door down." He then tossed the spike on the ground before reaching for the spike in his arm and began to pull on it while saying, "And as for why, it's because you were talking about some totally interesting stuff." And then pulled the spike out and caused some blood to splash on his face while saying, "You said he was alive. Our captain." He then looked at the 2 guards with a serious look and narrowed eyes, "And what was that about women breathing fire?" The 2 guards were terrified as they watched him toss the last spike to the ground. However, before they could answer, a voice came from a couple feet away and was getting closer. "What's all this commotion?" The owner of the voice was young knight with silverish lavender hair that was held in a ponytail, with some hair swept over the left side of their face and amber eyes. They wore a dark purple coat over regular, steel, full-body armor, with a sword at their side that has a U-shaped pommel, and the guard is made of 2 straight pieces with curves at the end, with one facing the sword and the other facing the pommel. "Jericho?" exclaimed one of the guards in relief. The now named Jericho then began said, "Ban of the 7 deadly sins. I don't know you escaped, but return there at once." While pointing their thumb in the direction of Ban's cell at the last part. "How about some respect, little girl?" Ban began, before continuing while stroking his beard, "I'm not sure how you were raised, but is that any way to talk to a hero?" Jericho just replied by saying, "I am an apprentice holy knight. You dare call me little girl? That's pretty disrespectful for a prisoner on death's door." Jericho then turned to the guards and ordered, "Go to Sir Gulgius and the others at once. Tell them all, Jericho had to defeat the fox in when he escaped and tried to resist." "Right," came the reply from the guards before they began leaving. After about a minute, it was now just Ban and Jericho, and they stood in silence for a moment before Jericho began to reach for her sword, then she began running at him before she began to swing her sword at a fast pace. To a normal person, it would look like there were multiple Jerichos attacking Ban. "Ah!" screamed Ban, while Jericho then appeared behind Ban before flicking and sheathing her sword while not facing Ban, believing she had just defeated him. But then instead of hearing the sound of a bleeding body falling to the ground, "Ah ew, ho ho. Do you think I had you take off too much?" asked Ban as he turned around, rubbing his chin while also showing his new haircut with a satisfied smirk on his face. Jericho turned around in shock, with wide eyes as she watched Ban rub his chin. "Well, it feels pretty good, so I guess I'm okay with it. You got some real talent with that sword there, little lady. Keep practicing and you might be able to beat me one day," Ban said while complimenting her, causing her to blush lightly from the compliment. Jericho then shook her head and asked, "How did you dodge my sword with all those injuries?" sounding slightly shaken up. Ban looked kinda surprised before he replied, "Injuries? What are you talking about? Huh?" Before he began waving his arms up and down, along with his legs, while examining himself, showing that his body had no injuries on it. Jericho then looked really shaken up before saying, "That's impossible. Your limbs were full of holes from steel spikes running through them. It'd be good if you remembered this, little lady," began Ban, gaining Jericho's attention. "There's only one wound on me, and it's this one right here, got it? he continued, while now pointing at the scar that was on his neck and led up to his cheek. Jericho was surprised by this, but she didn't have a chance to reply, as Ban then said, "So you could say that injuries I get from that guy are kinda a special case, I guess." Jericho was surprised by this information, but before she could come up with something to say, Ban then added one more thing. Now, Ban began with his head slightly down to shadow his eyes, before he then raised it and looked at Jericho with the same look that he gave the guards from before, and said, "Maybe you can tell me about these women who breathe fire." The look he had on put Jericho slightly on edge, and yet, at the same time, it slightly turned her on from seeing how powerful and handsome he looked. Sometimes she really hated how much her teacher rubbed off on her. Meanwhile, back at Dr. Dana's office. Anko, Elizabeth, and Hawk were back inside Dr. Dana's office, where they found Meliodas on the bed sleeping. Elizabeth was sitting next to the bed watching Meliodas to make sure he was alright. Hawk was resting on a stool nearby, and Anko was leaning against the wall, next to the door. As they were watching Meliodas, Dr. Dana came into the room and asked, "How is the patient doing?" Elizabeth answered, "He been doing well. That medicine you gave him seems to have put him to sleep." Hawk agreed and said, "Yeah, he looks dead or something." Elizabeth got scared by this before she turned to Hawk and exclaimed, "Hawk, don't say that." Anko then finally decided to ask something that had been on her mind since the three of them came into the room with Meliodas. "Hey Drive. Dana, I know you're a man of medicine and all, but something has been bothering me about that medicine," she asked while pointing to the bowl that had held the medicine before Meliodas drank it. Dr. Dana turned to Anko and asked, "Yes, what is it?" Anko then moved to the doctor and had an angry look on her face before she picked up the doctor by his collar, surprising Hawk and Elizabeth. If it was supposed to be medicine, Anko began, getting Dr. Dana to begin to lightly sweat at what he figured she was about to ask, "Then why does it smell so much like poison?" Elizabeth and Hawk were now really surprised at what Anko was accusing the doctor of, but before they could say anything, Dr. Dana said, "Because it is." It caused Elizabeth and Hawk to go wide-eyed, with Anko getting angrier, but the doctor continued, "Wolfsbane, belladonna, tiger beetle, henbane leaf make a deadly poison when mixed. Once taken, you begin to feel sleepy before you decide to go to sleep, where you then never wake your eyes again. No pain, no suffering." Anko was now livid at what the person who was supposed to help decided to go against their oath and instead kill one of the people who they were supposed to help that could have helped them stop the Holy Knights. Elizabeth was distraught at finding out that Meliodas was dead, as was Hawk, however before any of them could say anything, they all heard a voice. "Do please forgive the good doctor, he was after all only doing what he was told in exchange for his daughter." Anko dropped Dana and moved to Elizabeth and Hawk before pulling out two kunai that she held in a reverse grip in both hands. Then, out of nowhere, a knight appeared in the room, standing between the group and Dr. Dana. He wore full body armor, with his torso covered in a metal breastplate, while his arms were covered in metal chainmail. The upper part of his legs were covered in armor as well, but the rest were clad in knee-length metal boots. His helmet however was what really brought attention. It looked like a demon with slanted eyes, 9 dots were over each eye, a mouth of shark teeth, and horns on the side. Behind him looked to be a sword with the blade appearing to be a foot in width and a foot and a half in length. The group were surprised at this holy knight just appearing out of nowhere who had his right arm placed in front of him, as if he were going to bow, and said, "Allow me to introduce myself, I am Holy Knight Golgius of the Weird Fangs." He then bowed slightly and put his right arm forward towards Elizabeth. "Princess Elizabeth, I have come to pick you up." Hawk then got in front of Elizabeth and exclaimed, "Not so fast. I, Sir Hawk, Knight of Scrap's Disposal, shall be your opponent." However, Sir Golgius didn't bother with Hawk and simply said, "And, this sword." He exclaimed while lifting the blanket from Meliodas' body to show Meliodas still held onto the sword. Golgius then turned to Meliodas and said, "7 sins Meliodas, this is worthless while in your hands, so we will be taking it back." Sir Golgius then began to reach for the sword, but when grabbed the sword and held it up to examine it, he noticed Meliodas was still holding onto it, standing with shadowed eyes. Everyone was shocked to see that Meliodas was standing, even though they had been informed that he had taken a powerful poison. While they were all trying to figure out how this happened, Meliodas was remembering a night from the past. Flashback, many years ago. It was the middle of the night, Diane, Ban, and Meliodas were all camping out in a canyon. Lying next to them were the dead bodies of some monsters that they had killed. Currently, Diane was sleeping on the ground off to the side, and Ban and Meliodas were sitting by the fire. They had just finished eating when Ban decided to say something that had been on his mind for a while. "Hey, Captain." Meliodas was drinking some alcohol and said, "Yeah, what is it? How come you always have that sword with you?" Ban asked, "I mean, I've never seen you without it, what's so special about it anyways?" "It's not that special," replied Meliodas. "So can I see it?" Ban asked. "Sorry Ban, but you can't," replied Meliodas. Diane moved over to behind Meliodas and grabbed the hilt of the sword. Come on, just let me have a little peek. Ban was then surprised when Meliodas grabbed the hilt as well and said, let go, Ban. It was at this time that Diane began to wake up and while rubbing her eyes, she said, hey you two, you're still up. Just step away Ban, you don't want to make me angry. Meliodas said. Ban blinked his eyes before he asked, make you angry, are you serious? You and me have been hanging together for a lot of years now. And in all that time, I've never seen you get mad once. I mean it. Said Meliodas, with his eyes now covered by his hair. Diane is still off on the side, watching with a worried expression when she heard Ban say how he was wondering how Meliodas got called the Dragon Sin of Wrath. She decided to find out what was going on and asked, Ban, what do you think you're doing? Ban then began to really try and take the sword by pulling with both hands, and while doing this, he was saying, if doing this means I get to see you angry, then I want to see it even more. Ban then got a greedy glint in his eyes and said, no, I want to steal it. It was then that Meliodas swung the sword and sliced Ban along the left side of his neck and on part of his cheek from his chin. Diane then exclaimed, Ban. Worried for her best friend, who just got sliced. Ban then jumped back and landed on his feet while chuckling before he said, well, looks like I just saw a hit inside of you. Cool. While rubbing some of the blood away from the wound. Meliodas then began to say, sorry about that, Ban. But this sword is. Flashback end. Suddenly, an immense amount of pressure began to fill the room before Meliodas said, I can never let go of the sword, even if I die. This is the only thing I can do to atone for my sin. Meliodas then looked at Golgius and showed that he had black eyes as well as a black spiral mark above his right eye. Golgius began to shake in fear, however before he could escape, he was captured by several purple chains that had energy coming off of them. This snapped Meliodas out of it as everyone looked to see that it was Kushina with chains coming out of her back, holding Golgius in place, with an angry look on her face as well with the rest of the Kunoichi standing all around the room. I don't like it when someone sneaks up on me, however, I hate it when someone sneaks up on people I care about. Kushina said, before she then slowly began tightening the chains around Golgius. Everyone could hear the sound of creaking metal, meaning that Kushina was slowing crushing Golgius. Golgius was shouting in pain, please spare me. Hold on, Kushina-sensei. Spoke Anko, gaining everyone's attention, we can't kill him because he said they are holding the doctor's daughter hostage. So, how about you give him to me so I can find out where exactly? All the Kunoichi agreed and Elizabeth, Meliodas and Hawk could see a certain glint in Anko's eyes that made them shiver. However, Golgius decided to be really stupid and exclaimed, ha! You'll never get anything out of me, you stupid bitch. At this, the room went silent before everyone felt and saw a dark aura around Anko as she stood with shadowed eyes before she looked at Golgius and they all saw in her eyes, said the word dark before Anko then said, well, I guess you really need to be taught a lesson. Anko then grabbed Golgius by one of the horns on his helmet before saying, come along now, it's time that Mistress Anko gives you a lesson. With that, they all watched Anko disappear into another room with Golgius before they began to hear cries of pain and shouts begging for mercy. This continued for 5 minutes where Anko then walked out looking very pleased with herself before she then told everyone, well, it as turns out, the doctor's daughter was also being held at base dungeon. So, this actually works for us because as we look for Ban, we can also look for the man's daughter while we're at it. This kills 2 birds with 1 stone. The group agreed with this, but then Meliodas decided to add, actually, we'll only need to focus on finding Cette. Everyone was confused by this and Satsuki asked, why? I thought we were also supposed to get banned from base dungeon as well. Everyone was nodding at this before Meliodas elaborated, well, you see, we only need to focus on finding the doctor's daughter because if I know Ban, he'll have heard that we're here and will have busted himself out already and is simply waiting for us. Everyone now had a look of understanding at what Meliodas was saying and decided to trust his word. And with that, all the Kunoichi, Elizabeth, Meliodas and Hawk all began to make their way out of the town towards base dungeon. As they were walking, Elizabeth suddenly remembered something. Oh. She exclaimed getting everyone's attention before she pulled out Meliodas' bag and sheath for his sword. While you were sleeping, I fixed your things for you. It might not be very good but. Oh, thanks Elizabeth. Said Meliodas as he put his stuff back on. And with that, the group continued towards base dungeon. However, as they were on their way, Diane suddenly appeared in front of them, which startled Elizabeth, Hawk and Hinata at her sudden appearance. Diane? Asked Meliodas, what are you doing here? Diane was staring at them with blank eyes, Captain. She wondered for a second before her eyes widened and she started exclaiming, Captain you're supposed to be resting. What are you doing here? He's fine, but the important question is, what are you doing here? Kushina asked, curious on why Diane was here. What do you mean what am I doing here? Asked Diane, genuinely curious. Anko then stepped and said, well, after you helped me finish the rest of the bugs attacking the town, you began to follow the plan and were headed to base dungeon so that you could check it out while you wait for us to meet you there. Diane was silent before she tilted her head and asked, I did. At this, the group began to suspect that something was off, that was at least, until they all suddenly heard a bell ring and then Diane began to shout, a holy night. While looking right at Meliodas. They watched Diane looked around asking where Meliodas was until she suddenly attacked Meliodas while shouting, give them back. Diane's attack launched Meliodas a good several meters back before he crashed and stopped moving. The group was shocked by this, then they saw Diane grip her fist and say, let me say this to your face, I won't lose to some holy knight. Everyone then began running as Diane began to chase them, and as they were running, they noticed a man and a child walking. They all grabbed the two before they hid in a ditch. They all peeked over the edge to see that Diane had stopped and was now looking for them. Kurenai then noticed that Diane's eyes were clouded over and she then understood what was happening, she's in an illusion. Everyone looked at Kurenai in shock before she explained, her eyes are clouded over so she wasn't able to see us. Diane must have been seen and got caught in the illusion that makes her see Meliodas as the holy knight that casted the illusion. Everyone then had wide eyes at realizing this, but then Kurenai continued, and earlier, she was fine and talking to us, but then a bell ringing was heard and she then began attacking us, so it had to be caused by a bell. Kurenai was still explaining, but then she trailed off as she stared at something with narrowed eyes, and everyone began to look at where she was staring, where they saw the boy and the man. They all then noticed the boy's staff had a little bell on it, this caused everyone to be on alert. Who are you? Shouted Kurenai, you are clearly behind this turn of events, so who are you? The boy began chuckling before he was replaced with a holy knight. This one was wearing deep blue armor with a long black skirt. He was wearing a helmet that looked like a human face and had 22 holes on both sides, and in his hand was a larger version of the staff the boy was previously holding. Well, you seem to have caught on rather quickly. My name is Ruin of the Weird Fangs and I will be the one to bring ruin to the 7 deadly sins. At the same time, the group then heard buzzing and looked up to see more insects coming their way. They then also heard a loud boom and turned to also see Meliodas and Diane fighting when they noticed that Meliodas now had clouded eyes as well. The group decided to then split up, Anko, Hinata, and Satsuki would deal with the bugs, Kurenai, Naruto, and Hana would try and break Diane and Meliodas out of the illusions, and finally Kushina and Tenten would deal with Ruin. The group then separated and headed off to do their tasks, and they all thought the same thing. Damn, this is going to suck. Back in base dungeon. While this was all going on, there was a bit of excitement also happening back at base dungeon. Find the 7 sins ban. The fox sin of greed. Shouted Jericho. Right away but Lady Jericho began one of the many knights that were currently in the hall. Why are you dressed like that? Finished another knight. You see, right now, Jericho is sitting on the floor in nothing but her pink frilly bra and panties, with only her coat to cover herself, even though it was slightly shortened. Jericho was blushing brightly and said, never mind that. Now, go get me a change of clothes and my suit of armor. The knights were just staring and leering at her with lust, making Jericho feel very uncomfortable before she shouted, what are you waiting for? I said go. But that the group of knights began running to get what Jericho needed, with one standing in place staring at her for a little longer before another knight came back and grabbed him, taking him away before they were all gone. I can't believe he was right. She said, while remembering what Ban had told her before she had been found. Flashback, a couple minutes ago. Ban was currently holding Jericho up by her cheeks with his hand underneath her chin. She dropped her sword as she was having a hard time breathing and said, just finish me. But she was surprised when Ban instead simply lowered her so she could breathe easily again, which caused her to begin coughing before he said, you know, despite whatever stories were told about me and the others, we're not actually the bad guys. It's the holy knights that you serve that are the bad guys. Jericho was surprised by this and exclaimed, that's a lie. The holy knights are the good guys. They're ones who are trying to protect this country. Yes, but from whom and at what cost? This question threw Jericho for a loop as she began to think about it, but she wasn't allowed to think for long before Ban continued, you see, if the holy knights are supposed to be these good guys that you believe, then why are they causing problems for people? Why are they threatening people for supplies instead of simply requesting them? Why are they raping innocent women? And also, if they were such good guys then why are they the ones who are causing so many issues? And all of this was done in the name of the holy knights. Jericho began to really think about this because she didn't want to believe that the holy knights were really that bad, but as she thought about it more, she began to realize that he was right. She had tried to ignore it, but she remembered her teacher, Vermilion Sensei, also saying how the Holy Knights had a dark secret. She remembered her teacher telling her how, if it wasn't the only way to keep them from corrupting her, who was such an honest and righteous soul, she would never have joined the Holy Knights. If what you say is true, then why have I not seen it for myself? Asked Jericho. Ban answered by saying, that is because you are never in the right place at the right time and never look in the right direction. But, I will help by putting you in the right position so that you can see exactly what I mean. Just don't hate me for what I will have to do. And with that, Ban's voice began to echo and fade. Flashback end. Jericho, still with her blush and clutching the coat to her body, said, I still don't like how I had to go through with this. She then began to blush even darker when she remembered what he told her after taking her armor and clothes, but at least he told me I have nothing to be ashamed about. But Ban, after discarding Jericho's clothes and armor because of them not fitting, is now walking through Based, looking around a couple of cells when he sees a short, fat and ugly knight crouching in front of a cell, looking inside with a look of lust. Ban, curious as to what the man is looking at, walks over and asks, what you looking at? The knight then responded by saying, her. Isn't she a fine woman? Ban then looked inside the cell and saw a woman currently chained to the wall. She has shoulder-length lightish brown hair, soft brown eyes, and was wearing a pair of glasses. She was also wearing a white blouse that hugged her D-cup breasts, with a dark blue long-sleeved shirt over that. She was also wearing a long white skirt with a belt and sandals. She looked very beautiful, but currently, she looked very cute as she looked back at them with an embarrassed blush on her cheeks. The knight then explained how Golgius had kidnapped her and that her name was Cette and that she was the daughter of a doctor in Dalmari. I just can't get enough of her. It's alright if we take her right. I mean no one is looking. Ban then said, I like her. This got the knight to look at him, hey, I was here first, who are you? Ban simply smiled at the man before he slammed the guy's head into the bars, knocking him out and slightly scaring Cette. She then watched as Ban gave her a lazy smile while raising his hand to show her he meant no harm. He then reached for the bars and then bent all of them to the side before entering the cell. Cette was shaking as she watched a man advance towards her, fearing that he would do something to her. Ban then crouched in front of her and lightly cupped her chin with his right hand before he began moving it towards her shirt while saying, I'll be, his hand then went in between her dark blue shirt and blouse. This caused Cette to shut her eyes and fear for the worse before he then pulled out a dagger while he finished saying, borrowing your dagger. Cette saw this and said, my father gave me that to protect myself. Ban looked at the dagger before he went on to describe the dagger before he then waved his arm to the side, slicing the chains off of Cette and the wall, and finished by saying that the sharpness wasn't bad. Ban then crouched back down in front of Cette and said with a soft smile, your father must love you very much to give an excellent blade like this. Cette began to blush at Ban's smile before she then accepted the dagger back and said, thank you for giving this back. Well, it given to me to protect myself, it was also my mother's memento. Ban smiled at her before he stood up and offered her a hand, which she gratefully took and stood up with his help. As the two were beginning to exit the cell, they heard a voice address Ban. Where do you think you're going, Ban of the 7 deadly sins? Ban and Cette turned and saw another holy knight standing in the hall, looking in their direction. This one was wearing dark-colored armor with spikes all over his armor. He was carrying a shield that had spikes all around the perimeter, with a rose insignia on it. His helmet looked like a bunch of purple metal vines that covered his face, only leaving one red eye visible. He then added, you are going to die right here and now. Ban simply smirked and said, yo, Holy Knight Jude. Behind him, Cette looked at Ban and was thinking, this man is one of the 7 deadly sins. You're going to kill me? Why do it now? Asked Ban. We have no more use for you. You were simply bait for the sins captain and you've fulfilled that role. Explained Jude before he continued, my fellow knights should be finishing up with your 2 fellow sins right about now. And once I've killed you, there will be 4 less criminals in the world. Ban simply began chuckling before he said, I hope your dream comes true. Jude then asked, 5 years ago, who was it that caught and tortured you, or have you forgotten? Ban simply stared at Jude with a stoic look while saying nothing. Back with the others. The group was having a tough time against the Holy Knights, considering there were 2, and almost half of their group was trying to break the illusions on Meliodas and Diane. They wouldn't have as much of an issue fighting the 2 if it wasn't for the fact that one of them can fight with bugs almost exactly like an Aburami, while the other can cast illusions like no tomorrow. All in all, it was not easy. Right now, Anko, Hinata and Satsuki were trying to stop the bug using Holy Knight. Anko and Satsuki were using multiple Gakakik no jutsus to burn all the bugs, while Hinata was using her clan's Haki KKSHM in order to send blasts of air, annihilating large groups of bugs as well. It was an incredibly slow process and they needed a lucky break or else they would run out of chakra. As that was going on, Kushina and Tenten were fighting against Ruin, who kept casting illusions at them, which they had to stop and then focus on breaking out of them. But every time they did this, they gave Ruin the chance to attack them, which he always took. It was now beginning to get on their nerves on how he fought, because they thought he would be physically weak since he used illusions, but that turned out to be very wrong when he would launch an attack that would send them skidding back several feet. They had to be on their toes the entire time, but it wasn't easy since they would never know when he would cast an illusion until it was too late. This led to them being covered in bruises and scratches from Ruin's attacks and skidding on the ground. Meanwhile, Hana and Naruto were all trying to stop Diane and Meliodas from moving around so much in order for Kurenai to break them of the illusions they were currently under. Naruto was trying to use her chains to tie up the two sins, but they were so strong and quick that it was very difficult for Naruto to get a proper hold on one of them. "Come on, damn it," exclaimed Naruto, "just sit still long enough for us to help." Naruto was trying again to stop Diane so that Kurenai could break them out of it. Hana was using some Doton jutsus to try and slow them down. They kept trying and trying until finally they caught a lucky break when Hana managed to turn the ground into thick mud that made it hard for Diane and Meliodas to move, which gave Naruto the opportunity to wrap her chains around Diane's torso and legs, along with Meliodas as well, but they were beginning to struggle, which made it difficult for Naruto to keep her hold on them. "Kurenai. Do it, now. While I still have a hold on them," exclaimed Naruto, who was sweating and panting very hard because of how much focus and energy it was taking her to hold the two sins in place. Kurenai nodded her head and rushed between Meliodas and Diane before she put her hands in the ram seal and then shouted "Kai," while sending out a burst of chakra that made them both stop struggling before they both then shook their heads and looked very confused. Why are we being held in chains?" asked Diane, who was greatly confused on what happened along with Meliodas. "You were both caught in an illusion that made you think the other was a holy knight in order to attack each other in an attempt to destroy the other," explained Naruto as she began to release Diane and Meliodas from her chains. The two were surprised at this before they got angry expressions on their faces and turned to see the two holy knights that were still there. Meliodas and Diane glanced at each other before they nodded and took off for their respective targets, with Meliodas heading towards Ruin and Diane heading towards Freesia. When Meliodas got to Ruin, he grabbed his arm tightly, bending the metal to his grip while saying, "You are a terrible knight." This surprised Ruin as he exclaimed, the spell was broken. Meliodas then punched Ruin in the stomach with so much force, he broke the ground and launched Ruin into the wall of base dungeon. This surprised all of the knights who were outside around base dungeon as lookouts. Meliodas was moving towards Ruin who tried to attack him, but Meliodas had dodged all of the attacks before he then slammed his fist into Ruin's torso, shattering the man's armor. "You managed to break my armor, impressive," said Ruin. "Did you think I would say something like that?" exclaimed Ruin before he showed his 8-pack abs. "This armor is nothing more than shallow skin. My true armor is this body, which is harder and stronger than steel." Ruin then looked forward and exclaimed, "Well, what are you going to do now?" However, he wasn't expecting Meliodas to bury his fist so far into his body that it threatened to come out of his back. Ruin began coughing up blood before he was launched towards the wall of base again. Meliodas then said, "You tried to turn me and my friend against each other. That is your sin." Back inside based, with Ban. Back inside, we find Cette back inside her cell, peeking past a corner with a worried look. She was watching as Jude had put a spike through the center of Ban's chest. Ban had Jude was in Ban's face when he began by asking, "Is it painful?" Jude then moved to be in Ban's face when he continued, "Didn't I already say it? You already filled your role, Fox's sin Ban." "Do you know why I was captured by you 5 years ago?" asked Ban. Jude just scoffed and said, "You make it sound like you got captured by me on purpose." "Back then, I wanted pain," Ban said, surprising both Jude and Cette, who was still watching, before Ban continued, "I wanted the feeling of pain in order to be punished for my past. But I think I've been punished enough." Ban ended with a bloody smile as he grabbed the spike and began to pull it out. Ban looked over to Cette and said, "I don't want you to think badly of me, so could you please turn around or go back into the cell? I will call you out when I am done." Cette nodded slowly before she went back inside the cell, where she then heard the sound of metal and flesh being pierced, which caused her to flinch. "You see, I thought I had failed my group and that they all died. That is why I wanted to feel pain, but you just told me the captain is alive. That means that I no longer need to blame myself, so I no longer need to be punished," Ban said. As it turned out, that Ban had returned the favor and stabbed Jude in the center of his chest straight through his armor. Jude began to talk in a shaky voice that was slowly growing weaker. "Why, you're plotting the same thing from 10 years ago, aren't you? To overthrow the kingdom? Well, just know that every single holy knight in the K kingdom will declare war on the 7 deadly sins. Anne just looked at Jude before saying, you seem to messed in the head because we never tried to overthrow the kingdom. And with that, Jude died before his body began sliding to the ground. Anne sighed before he moved to the cell where Cette was still inside and said, hey, sorry you had to hear all of that. I hope I didn't scare you. Cette looked at Ban with slightly fearful eyes before she saw his slightly sheepish expression with his still lazy eyes. Cette began to calm down before she shook her head no, showing she wasn't scared of Ban. Ban gave a small smirk before he offered his hand to her, which she gratefully took before they began moving to try and find an exit. Outside base dungeon. The knights were now very fearful at Ruin being defeated. They then heard another crash and turned to see that it was Freesia who had crashed into the ground without most of her armor, with the only pieces left being her left boot and her right gauntlet. Freesia can now be seen as quite the beautiful woman, despite the multiple bruises, scratches and cuts. She had a curvy figure as seen by her double D cup breasts that were hugged inside of her sleeveless pinkish red leotard which showed a great amount of cleavage and had a diamond cutout that revealed her smooth stomach. She also had black arm and leg warmers. She had light brown hair and soft brown eyes that currently showed she was in a great amount of pain. This caused the knights to begin running away and not looking back. She muttered, damn, I knew these 3 were dumbasses. I hate how the holy knights are now. So, why did I join these guys? She thought no one heard her, but Diane, who had been moving towards her to knock her out, did and was surprised by this. She had never expected there to be holy knights who don't like being holy knights. She then moved over and gently lifted Freesia up to her face before asking in a quiet tone so that only the 2 of them knew what was being said. Are you really not like the holy knights? Freesia looked up at Diane with eyes that were as widened as possible, considering all the pain she was in, before she replied, no, I originally joined because I thought the holy knights were actually good, but then I watched and experienced how they actually aren't. I watched knights steal from the people we were supposed to help, kill the people, cause problems, and rape people. I experienced their evilness because they took advantage of the fact that I'm a woman and made it almost impossible to get where I am. They made it where anything I did was taken by someone else and they received the credit. They made it where I had to give my body to higher ranked knights just to get the credit of any missions I did and I hated it. Freesia at this point had begun to cry from remembering the suffering and hardship she went through and saw while a part of the holy knights. Diane was appalled at all of the suffering Freesia went through, especially since they did this to their own knights. Diane was also angered by how someone wasn't recognized for their achievements and could only gain the recognition by giving up her body. Finally, Diane was disgusted by how low the holy knights have fallen by actually demanding that one of their female knights give up her body just to be able to reach a higher position. Diane thought for a second before she asked, well, if you hate the holy knight so much, why do you stay with them? Freesia then looked up at Diane with wide eyes that had tears in them before she began to think about it. Why did she stay with the holy knights? They did nothing good for her or the people. She had joined them because she thought they were the good guys, but were they? No. They were not. They were terrible people who had caused the suffering of the people. They were the ones who killed innocent people with no remorse. And they were the ones who took her virginity that she had been saving for when she finds someone to love. I don't know anymore, but I don't want to stay. That is for sure, said Freesia. Diane then softly smiled and asked, how would you like to come with us then? Freesia was surprised by this sudden offer before she began to smile softly while closing her eyes and replied, yeah, I would like to come along. Diane nodded before she slowly and gently took off her bag before she opened it and began to softly place Freesia inside. Before Diane closed it however, Freesia said, thank you for helping me. I would like to return the favor now by telling you we're the doctor's daughter and the Sin are. Diane looked surprised before she nodded her head and said, thank you, and don't worry. Once we get back to town, we'll make sure you're taken care of until you're all better. Freesia smiled and said, thank you, and you are looking for the round building of the dungeon on the right side. That is where the 2 of them are. Diane smiled and said, thank you for that information. Now get some rest, you're still really hurt. Freesia nodded her head before she closed her eyes and began to sleep. Diane closed her bag, then she slowly and carefully put it back on before she walked over and met the Kunoichi, Elizabeth, Hawk, and Meliodas. Meliodas then asked, so, did you find out where they are? He then looked back to where she came from and asked, and what happened to the holy knight you were fighting? Yeah, the holy knight told me they're over there in the round building on the right-hand side. Diane said, well pointing to the building she was told, as for where she is, began Diane before she pointed to her bag, she surprised me. It turned out, she didn't like the holy knights anymore and she wanted to leave, so I put her inside of my bag, where she is sleeping right now. I promised her that after we get Ban and the doctor's daughter, she would receive medical attention. Everyone was surprised to hear that a holy knight didn't like being a holy knight anymore and instead wanted to go with them. Then the Kunoichi and Elizabeth smiled at how kind Diane was for accepting and helping an enemy who no longer wished to be an enemy. Well, began Meliodas, let's head on inside. The group then began to move towards the entrance before they all went inside. Once they went inside, the entrance was sealed before there was an exclamation of, the entry has been sealed with the sins and their accomplices inside. Jericho, who was now in some clothes and new armor, turned and asked, what are your order, Sir Golgius? We find a heavily damaged Golgius, with breaks, dents, and cracks all over his armor, standing as best he can, before he said, I'm impressed, 7 deadly sins. To deal such a blow to the weird fangs and turn one of us against the rest, Golgius then held a small black orb between his fingers that had a symbol on it, before he continued, however, that strength has instead invited your agonizing death. Jericho looked at Golgius in shock for what he held in his hand, that's an incantation orb. She exclaimed before she began thinking, if he activates that, then they won't be able to come back out ever. That means I won't be able to see Ban again to thank him. As Jericho realized that she won't be able to see Ban again, Golgius answered, correct. It's an incantation to trigger the trap. Golgius then threw the orb down to the ground, causing a thick purple smoke to appear, before it grew and slowly began to cover the entirety of base dungeon. This is the counter trap for the 7 deadly sins, the Eternal Seal spell. It is a seal so powerful that they wouldn't be able to break it, even with 10 tyrant dragons. Ha 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 ha. Golgius then began laughing like a madman, thinking that the 7 deadly sins won't be able to escape. Meanwhile, Jericho was feeling distraught at that because she had wanted to meet Ban again in the future after she received more training from her teacher. Please, let them find a way out. Jericho mentally prayed so that the other knights around her won't be able to hear her. Inside base dungeon. The group were walking through base looking for where Ban and Cette might be when they came up to a part that was only human-sized. It's too narrow for me to keep going, complained Diane. However, from the door came Cette, who was surprised to see all of them. Oh. Hello, my name is Cette and I'm the daughter of a doctor in Dalmary town. You wouldn't happen to know a way out of here for me and my friend, would you? Cette asked after introducing herself. Everyone was surprised to have found the doctor's daughter so easily, which was voiced by Diane. Wait, if you're Dr. Dana's daughter, then who? Diane's voice began to trail as they heard footsteps coming from the door before they all saw Ban come out of the door and standing next to Cette with his hands in his pockets and slightly slouched. When everyone saw him, they all had different reactions. Diane began to smile brightly at seeing her friend, Elizabeth, Hinata, and Kurenai began to blush at his muscular, shirtless elf. Anko, Tenten, Hana, and Satsuki began to stare at his body lustfully, but it was Kushina, and Naruto looked on with smiles at seeing that they found Ban. Naruto! Exclaimed Kurami from inside Naruto's head, getting her to jump slightly, which was noticed by Kushina. What? What is it? Is something wrong? Naruto asked Kurami in her mind, fearing that something happened. That's him. That's Naruto. Exclaimed Kurami, causing Naruto to go wide-eyed, which made Kushina curious and slightly worried for Naruto. Naruto, what's wrong? Asked Kushina. However, before Naruto could answer, they heard Meliodas talk. Ban? Asked Meliodas. Hey, Captain. Replied Ban. Now, it was silent as the two stared at each other with tense looks. The atmosphere also felt tense, as everyone could feel the tension. They both seem upset. What's going on? I've got a bad feeling about this, said Hawk, slightly scared. Diane then sat on the ground and said, you're right. I think all of you may want to get behind me and hide there. This scared Hawk even more, and he let out a whimper. Cette also moved over the group as well. Meliodas and Ban continued to stare at each other before they then narrowed their eyes a bit. Then, Lion! Exclaimed a happy Meliodas as he raised his arms high in the air. Captain! Exclaimed a happy Ban, who had put his hands up. The two began running towards each other, laughing, before they began to slap each other's hands multiple times. The Kunoichi sweat dropped at the sight of two of Britannia's worst criminals acting like children, while Cette, Diane, and Elizabeth giggled at their actions. Hawk asked, what's that? A game of patty cake gone horribly wrong? They then watched as Ban raised both his arms up with a smile and exclaimed, Captain. Before he slammed both arms into Meliodas, sending him flying through multiple walls, before he finally came to a stop. Everyone went wide-eyed at this, as they had never expected Meliodas to just get sent flying through walls. Ha 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 ha. My turn. Me next. Ha 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 ha. Ban exclaimed, laughing while jumping up and down and waving his arms. Meliodas then came flying into Ban and head-butted Ban and sent him flying through multiple walls as well. The whole hall was shaking from the two sins' antics, and Diane just looked bored, with Hawk asking, "Do I wanna know?" "Just roll with it." Diane answered boredly with a sigh. The two were now laughing, with Ban still laying down where he got knocked, and Meliodas was giggling, well bent over, holding his knees. "So great. I thought you'd might have gotten soft on me," Ban said, while getting up and looking no worse for wear, except for some dirt and a couple of scratches. Meliodas then began to dust off his shoulder, before he said, "You've still got it." The two then clasped their right hands together and slammed down onto the floor, looking like they were about to arm wrestle. "Ready?" Ban said slowly. "Go!" Meliodas exclaimed. The two then began to wrestle, and the amount of strength that the two were using caused cracks to start spreading everywhere, with the two of them at the center of it all, the walls all beginning to break down, just from the two sins having an arm wrestle match. Hawk was now sitting on Diane's knees and was exclaiming, "What's happening?" Diane now had a soft smile as she watched the captain and her object of affection enjoy their reunion. "Those two have been like that as long as I've known them." The Kunoichi all heard Diane and all exclaimed along with Hawk, "They've been like what?" "Just typical boys, so immature," Diane replied. As the rest of the group were watching this, Ban and Meliodas began talking. 720 times. "If I recall correctly, and I do, I've beat you 361 of them," Ban said. "You must have lost your mind. I've won 361 times," Meliodas rebutted. The building and hall just kept falling apart, but Meliodas and Ban were ignoring that and simply began putting in more effort as heard by them shouting. Meliodas and Ban were, somehow, still lying on solid pieces of stones, arm wrestling the whole way down, not caring about the building they were destroying from their match. The rest of the group were all falling down as well, with Cette being held by Kushina and Elizabeth being held by Naruto. All of the Kunoichi were falling calmly, with Elizabeth and Cette holding on to Naruto and Kushina like their lives depended on it. Diane simply fell calmly before saying, "Ban looks so handsome right now." "I don't think this is the time," exclaimed Hawk before he began screaming. Back with the knights outside. All of the knights watched in shock as the spell seal was taken down and base dungeon was being completely destroyed. Bulgius exclaimed in shock, "The barrier." While the other knights were watching in shock and were shouting in fear. Jericho, however, was shocked and was thinking, "Amazing. Just how much power do the sins even have?" Then Jericho began blushing as she remembered that Ban was also one of the sins, then she felt herself beginning to get a little hot between her legs, before she snapped out of it and shook her head, "Damn it, teacher. Why did I have to also pick up your like of strong men who can overpower me?" She shouted mentally, embarrassed that she picked up her teacher's love of strong men. But that last thought, Jericho heard Gulgius shout, "Strategic withdrawal." And all the knights began to run away. Jericho took one last look at the falling ruins of base dungeon, before she smiled and began running with the rest of the knights. Rubble of base dungeon. The Kunoichi were completely unharmed except for some dust, and were all making sure they were unharmed. They all saw they were fine, and also began to check on Cette and Elizabeth, and saw they were fine too. Diane then looked around and saw that it was already dusk before she said, "Oh, it's already dusk. No wonder I was starting to get hungry." Hawk was covered in bumps, bruises, scratches and dirt while exclaiming, "You guys are all ridiculous." Ban was laying down on some rubble and looked up at Meliodas who was standing and with a grin, said, "Anyways, good to see you again, Captain." Meliodas simply looked down at Ban with a smile. A couple minutes later, the group was almost back at Dalmari town when they saw all of the townsfolk looking at the ruins of base dungeon in shock. The townsfolk then saw Cette, safe and sound, and began rejoicing at the safe return of one of their own. Later, everyone was back at the doctor's building when they checked on Freesia and saw she was still sleeping and decided to let her sleep. The Kunoichi were all smiling at being able to successfully help a civilian and also find another of the 7 deadly sins. They were also especially happy that it was the sin they were looking for since they first arrived in Britannia. Elizabeth then suggested that they all go and make sure Cette was alright, which they agreed before Ban saw something out of the corner of his eye and began to walk away. Diane noticed this and asked, "Ban, where you going?" A little worried something might be wrong. This gained the attention of everyone else as well, who all turned to see Ban walking into town waving his back at them without turning around. "I'm gonna see if I can find some clothes. Don't worry, Diane. I'll be back a little later," Ban said, getting relieved sighs from everyone. As everyone was smiling at everything turning out okay, only one person wasn't smiling. "Is it true? Are you my Ani-chan?" wondered Naruto. Later at night. Everyone is now relaxing on top of the doctor's building with some drinks. Off to the side, Freesia was covered in bandages and was sitting up to eat some fruit as well. Everyone was enjoying themselves when Meliodas gained everyone's attention. "Alright, everyone. Meliodas raised his voice a little, allow me to now formally introduce him. This is the fox's sin of greed, Ban. Ban was currently sitting on a barrel with his right leg up on the barrel and his left leg hanging off. He had his right elbow resting on his leg and was cupping his chin and part of his face with his thumb and index finger. He was wearing a blood-red leather jacket with matching pants that were all covered in metal studs. Ban then say, hello everyone. Nice to meet you. Meliodas then noticed Ban's change in wardrobe and said, whoa. Where'd you get that suit? Well, I can't very well parade around half naked in front of a princess, now can I? Ban asked rhetorically. How'd you buy clothes without any money? Meliodas asked. I kinda stumbled across him. Ban said, it was a total fluke. The clothes he wears for most of the time before changing. Diane just looked to the side, kinda upset, and sighed, which brought Ban's attention to her. Hey Diane. It's been a while, huh? How have you been? I've been fine, not very happy you still have that habit of taking clothes that catch your eye. Diane said, which caused Ban to look slightly sheepish and scratch the back of his head. Well, it's not like I had money during most of those times. Ban replied, getting Diane to look at him with a deadpan stare. And the times you did have money? Diane asked. Hey, now that's not fair. You know very well that I spent that money on things such as food and supplies or whatever you guys wanted. I only stole clothes because I never had enough for myself afterwards. Ban explained, getting Diane to think about it before she sighed and looked back at him with a smile. I guess you're right. Sorry about that, it's just Diane began, before Ban cut her off. I know. You don't like watching me steal things because then that makes people mad at me. Don't worry, I remember. Ban said, while smiling at Diane, who smiled back. Began a voice from behind Ban, getting him to turn to a flustered-looking Elizabeth. It's very nice to meet you, Lord Ban. She exclaimed while bowing. Ban looked uncomfortable. It's okay, Your Highness. And we're not really big on ceremony, so let's just be friends, and please, just call me Ban. He said, with small smile. Elizabeth looked surprised before she, too, smiled and said, yeah. Does that include me? Asked a voice. Ban was confused and looked at Meliodas before asking, Captain, aren't we already friends? Why are you asking me again? He's not the one asking. Are you sure you don't have a couple of screws loose? Said the voice. Ban then gained a confused look, huh? Who said that? I did. Hawk said. Ban stared at Hawk for a second before exclaiming, there's a talking pig here. Everyone began to laugh at Ban's antics when Dr. Dana said, dinner's ready. Everyone began to eat and were enjoying themselves when Kushina exclaimed, oh. I almost forgot. Everyone began looking at Kushina as she pulled out a paper, a brush and some ink before she moved over to Diane. Diane. I just remembered, I finally finished the seal. Diane looked at Kushina in shock before she began to smile brightly. You're serious, you're not messing with me, right? Kushina shook her head and said, nope. I finally finished it in the last couple of hours. So, where do you want it? Diane was smiling brightly before she moved her wrist to Kushina and said, right here. Kushina smiled and nodded before she began applying the seal. Once she was done, Kushina put the stuff away and said, alright, all done. Now, all you have to do is push some mana into the seal and it'll activate. Diane nodded and began to focus. Everyone watched in rapt attention as suddenly, Diane was covered in a giant puff of smoke and when it cleared, there stood Diane in her shrunken jumpsuit at a height of 5 feet and 5 inches. She looked herself over before she began to smile brightly and had tears of joy falling from her eyes. Diane then felt a pair of arms around her and looked up to see Ban was the one holding her. Ban smiled at her and said, looks like you finally got your wish from all those years ago. Diane then remembered that she had told Ban that she wanted to be small in order to hug him, and he was right. She began to cry and hug Ban back, who returned the hug. They then released each other before Ban started to walk back to the others but was stopped by Diane, who held onto his sleeve, who had her head down. Diane? Asked Ban. Everyone was wondering what was happening before they were all shocked when Diane suddenly leapt at Ban before she wrapped her arms around her neck and began kissing Ban. Ban was wide-eyed before he relaxed into the kiss and began to return it. Everyone was smiling at this, even Naruto, who saw that Ban and Diane had stopped kissing and had decided to ask something that had been bothering her. Excuse me, Ban. This got everyone's attention as Naruto moved towards the two sins. Ban turned towards Naruto, who had a serious look. Yes, what is it? Naruto began to breathe before she asked something that got everyone's attention. I wanted to know, Naruto began, are you my Ani-chan? Everyone was surprised by this sudden question before they all heard Naruto continue, you see, my name is Naruto and I am a Jinchuriki and I hold the Kyuubi no Yoko and she is able to tell that my brother is alive because he holds the rest of her chakra. When we arrived, she told me that he had been motionless for the past several years, and when I first saw you inside of base dungeon, she told me that you hold her chakra. Everyone was wide-eyed at this, and they all turned to Ban, who had his eyes shadowed. Ban then sighed and looked at Naruto with a soft smile before saying, "I could never hide anything from you, right little sis?" Naruto was wide-eyed at this response before she began to tear up and smile, then she launched herself at him and began hugging him like crazy while saying, "I finally found you, Ani-chan." Ban just hugged her back and said, "Yes. Yes, you did." All of the Kunoichi, Meliodas and Diane were all shocked to hear that Ban was actually Naruto. They didn't know what happened to him over the years and they had so many questions, but they knew right now wasn't the time for questions. It was the time to celebrate. And so, the entire night, everyone celebrated for multiple reasons. For the safe return of Cette, Diane being able to now be their size, and finally finding Naruto. Everyone celebrated like no tomorrow, but they knew that tomorrow was coming, and with it, a lot of answers to their unanswered questions. So this part ends here. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, so quickly like this video for second part of this series. And comment down below your thoughts about this series. And now it's time for me to go, bye.